Okay, hi everyone. So I just want to do some brief background notes on one of the authors that we're briefly looking at for this week. And I know for this week we're doing a lot of some music. We'll be covering some spirituals in class, and then we're going to be looking at some work songs and some sermons and ballads, just as some examples to give you a good kind of overview of some of the vernacular tradition. Next week we're going to be looking more intensely at the blues and hip hop. So I know you'll have a wide variety to sort of look at and kind of compare. But I want to direct you here on your module tab to some of the additional resources on W.B. Du Bois. I know in many instances you have heard of him before. I'll try to bring up here some better images of him. Um, in in between your history classes and your literature classes as well. So I just kind of want to do a little bit of an overview. We are going to just very briefly look at a small excerpt of some of his writing for this week in comparison from obviously from the Souls of Black Folk, what we're looking at in different parts because I know your book has so much included in there as well. So I just want to kind of do a quick overview here and just to give a little bit of a sense of kind of where we're coming from. But if you know W.B. Du Bois or William Edward Bergerot Du Bois, we obviously know him by his abbreviations. In terms of his whole life, he's spanning all these different eras and areas of activism, history, sociology, as a writer, as an editor, and so forth. And he actually grew up in Massachusetts in a pretty tolerant and integrated community. He did graduate work at the University of Berlin and at Harvard, which was super significant. And many know him to be the first African American to earn a doctorate. He became a professor of history, sociology, and economics at Atlanta University. And of course, what you're reading directly on here is that even more significant for his contributions, he became one of the founders, of the NCAACP. So it's very, very important to really look at, well, there's just so much that we want to consider here with his life and his legacy and his readings that are included. It can be a little overwhelming, but just in the context of kind of what we want to look at for our class, and then should you go on and want to study a little bit more of his works too. So I'm always interested to see how you can sort of categorize his work by the different areas that he really dived into and immersed himself into. So one of the most famous quotes that you've probably heard by him is the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. And he wrote that as part of his really significant 1903 work, The Souls of Black Folk, from which we have pieces and excerpts of and chapters in your Norton anthology. And really, so much of his life here, from beginning where he grew up in New England, a really small African American community, all the way down to later on in his life, graduating with a PhD from Harvard. That was 1895. When he was 35, he published even some more significant works. You have the suppression of the African slave trade, the Philadelphia Negro, and of course, the Souls of Black Folk. Along with the founding of the NAACP, he was also a founder and leader of the Niagara Movement and the Pan-African Congress. He served as editor of the Crisis magazine. He lectured a big part of his life. So, needless to say here, he certainly did not sit idle on any sort of causes whatsoever, and that gives us such a great deal to really look at as we're going through his activism. You can see here the Niagara Movement was an African American protest group of scholars and professionals. Along those double lines, when he founded the NAACP from 1910 to 1934, served as its director. The Crisis, as I just mentioned, was his monthly magazine. And so within using that monthly magazine, you can see that they always made it a point to publish young African American writers, which is really big. And so continuing up to this day, of course, the NAACP is a leading protest organization, and Du Bois was part of that main sort of stream for that. along with those lines, some of the other controversy comes in when he did identify as a socialist and belonged to the Socialist Party for a brief point of his life. And that is some sort of parts of his criticism that get aligned with his ways of thinking. Um, Very near and dear and close to us, he actually taught for a while at the University of Pennsylvania for about a year and a half, and he studied, which was one of the pioneering parts of the urban community, was the Philadelphia Negro social study, and that really gained him a lot of prolific accolades too. So you can see here, I won't go through all of it, but in terms of his academia as a scholar, in terms of his own education, and then in part of where he's teaching and what he's studying and what he's doing, he's not only teaching in these realms, he's also writing novels, he's writing essays, he's writing poetry. He does take the chair of the Department of Sociology at Atlanta University. That's from 1934 to 1944. In the midst of writing a lot of different more both sociological and activist pieces. You can see here Black Reconstruction in America was one of his most significant historical works. I'm just using the source here, but I can bring up some of the other pieces here as well on Dubois. What's also really interesting is you have the Library of Congress linking to some of the digital collections that have pieces, not only photographs, posters from, the time period, but also, as you can see here, really significant parts of looking at some of his work. So that might be something that you want to kind of investigate a little bit more. And as a global citizen, of course, worldwide, as I mentioned earlier, he was an active participant in behalf of Pan-Africanism, concerned with the conditions of people of African descent wherever they lived. So there's very much worldwide perspective. These series of congresses spanned between 1919 and 1927, as you can see. Again, as part of sort of his worldwide efforts to talk and sort of lecture, and as you can see here, a lot of resolutions condemning colonialism, calling for alleviation of the oppression of Africans were passed. Not much action ended up taking place. This, of course, was to the later part of his life this led into. This ended up having him take citizenship up in Ghana in 1961. That's where he ends up actually passing away in 1963. I think he was about 95 years old when he passed away at that point. So definitely living a long life, full, whether people agreed or disagreed with him, it didn't matter on his modes of thinking. Certainly lived a long and prosperous life in terms of his activism and scholarship, and just sort of his following. He, in terms of we just got done reading Booker T. Washington for last week. I talked a little bit about this when I was going over Booker T. Washington, but a lot of Dubois and his supporters opposed the Atlanta Compromise. That was what Booker T. Washington's, one of his big things was. That would give the Southern blacks, the idea that they would work and submit to white political rule, and then the Southern whites would guarantee that African Americans could get basic education and economic rights. And as I was saying last week in the notes, Dubois insisted that full civil rights and increased political representation was the only way to go. And he thought a lot of this would come about by the African American intellectual elite. So those who were educated, those who had formal schooling. As you can see, that could be problematic as well for some others who didn't have that opportunity. So he really tackled a lot of racism. He strongly protested against lynching and Jim Crow and discrimination, particularly in education and in the job sector as well. So that was another area along with his writing that was really important. So there's so much between his early life, his time that, yes, he spent here, briefly in Philadelphia, and then, of course, early on his time transitions into the early 1900s and his work in the Pan-African conferences, the time that he spent abroad, and then, of course, addressing his relations with Booker T. Washington and the Atlanta Compromise. So I've got a lot of different resources here that you can definitely check out. I know your Norton's got an extensive biography of him as well. So, not to sort of belittle, there's also the Niagara movement, which he was involved with a lot of other African American civil rights activists. They got together here in 1906 between 1905 and 1906, and basically wrote their principles against the Atlanta Compromise. They wanted to publicize their ideals. Um, this was hard because a lot of the newspapers and places where he would publicize were leaning towards or had supported Booker T. Washington. So they had a hard time finding a place to actually get their ideas out and published. And in turn, that actually meant that Du Bois actually bought a printing press and started his own sort of weekly publishing place to get it out there. So again, that's not something that everyone can do, but the idea of having they call themselves the Niagarites after their Niagara conference up there, they would meet sort of repeatedly after that. So I'm really excited to look at different parts of the Souls of Black Folk. Like I said, we're going to break this up and read it over a couple weeks throughout our month because it is a lot to sort of read at once, and we won't get to every single part, but I think it is really important to to consider how some of what we're reading can relate to some of the texts from the past, but also lead us towards new ways of thinking in the future. So I know, like I said, some of you have encountered his work maybe in sociology classes or history classes, and so we'll try to add to your understanding as we read him in our literature class.